Okay, picture this. Phoenician princess, beach, beautiful white bull appears out of nowhere. She thinks, oh, lovely creature, reaches out to touch it, and boom! The bull, who is actually Zeus in disguise, grabs her and carries her across the sea. She didn't ask for this. It was imposed on her by a force she couldn't resist.
That's the myth of Europa. Classic Zeus move, really.
That's the myth of Europa. And according to the thinker we're discussing today, it's also the story of Russia and Europe, replayed again and again across centuries.
Russia as Zeus, Europe as the kidnapped princess. I mean, that's not exactly how you'd pitch it at a diplomatic reception, is it?
No. But that's Vadim Tsymbursky for you. A man who could read ancient Greek, quote Roman border treaties from memory, and then use all of that to explain why Russia keeps crashing into Europe like a moth into a lantern. Extraordinary mind. But before we get into the moth and lantern theory, hi, I'm Gregory.
And I'm Dina.
And this is the first episode of a new series, one we're making exclusively for our patrons. If you're hearing this, you've chosen to go deeper with us. And we mean that literally. No turning back now.
This series is different from what we normally do. It's slower, it's denser, and, I'll be honest, it's more personal. We're going through books, proper books, nonfiction, philosophy, political theory, geopolitics, the works that shaped how post-Soviet Russia argued with itself.
Everything we'll discuss was published after 1992, after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Convenient cutoff.
No late Soviet hindsight masquerading as prophecy. These are attempts to rethink Russia in a world where the old framework had already crumbled.
And most of them are practically invisible outside Russia. Influential at home, untranslated abroad. So the conversation existed, just in a language most of the world doesn't read.
Which is exactly why we wanted to do this series here, in this quieter space. These are books you need time with. They don't fit into a quick episode.
You already know how this works. Gregory went deep. I went along for the ride. Same dynamic, heavier material.
So, we're starting with someone who, if you want to understand how Russians have debated their place in the world over the past 3 decades, is almost impossible to ignore.
Vadim Tsymbursky. Not exactly a household name.
Born in 1957, died in 2009. Only 52 years old.
God, that's young.
Far too young. And like so many men of that generation, shaped by the late Soviet period, then ground down by the chaos that followed, he didn't get enough time.
So what drew you in?
The range. His intellectual life ran on 2 parallel tracks. On one hand, he was a serious classical scholar. Antiquity, Roman political thought, borders, empires, the language of ancient geopolitics.
Not exactly the trendiest field in 1990s Russia.
Not exactly. But for Tsymbursky, it wasn't decoration. He treated antiquity as a working laboratory, a place to watch empires form, crack, and dissolve over centuries, and then he applied those lessons to modern Russia.
And that's where he becomes dangerous, right?
That's where he becomes dangerous. He tried to build a philosophical model of Russia as a distinct civilization, with its own borders, its own rhythms, its own internal logic. This is where ideas like Island Russia and the Great Limitroph come from. And they were not slogans.
Though they very quickly sounded like slogans, as these things do in Russia.
Fair, but originally they were analytical tools, ways to think about Russia's position without defaulting to the usual script of catching up with Europe.
Or eternally resisting it.
Formally, Tsymbursky never climbed the academic ladder. He never earned the doctoral degree that would normally validate a career like his. No fancy titles, no big institutional backing.
Which in Russia either makes you invisible
Or oddly influential.
and in his case,
Very influential. His ideas were debated, challenged, reinterpreted, often by people who agreed on virtually nothing else. Conservatives saw him as an alternative to Western-centric narratives. Liberals, even when they disagreed, took him seriously.
Because he wasn't arguing in bad faith. You could tell.
He was asking questions that made everyone a little uncomfortable. And that's usually a good sign.
So what are we actually looking at today? The famous Island Russia essay?
We're starting there, yes. But the main focus is Return to Island Russia, a posthumous collection published in 2024, 15 years after his death. It gathers essays from different periods and shows how his ideas developed, and occasionally contradicted themselves.
Which only makes a thinker more interesting, not less.
At the core is the idea that Russia exists as a civilizational island, separated from Europe not by water,
But by history.
by political choices, by long-term structural patterns.
An island building bridges, and then wondering why they keep collapsing. Spoiler, it's not the bridges.
And one more thing before we dive in. Island Russia, the original essay, has never been properly translated into English.
Wait, seriously? One of the most influential texts in post-Soviet Russian thought, and it just doesn't exist in English?
It doesn't. Which means a huge part of Russia's intellectual self-reflection is completely missing from the global conversation. So consider this episode our attempt to open that door. Or at least peer through the keyhole.
Carefully, critically, and probably with a drink in hand.
And without pretending there's a map inside.
Let's see what this island actually looks like. Here we go.
So, Russia is an island. Let's unpack that, because I know it sounds absurd.
It does. Russia's the largest country on Earth, shares borders with 14 nations. Calling it an island is like calling the Sahara a nice little garden.
And Tsymbursky knew it sounded counterintuitive. But the metaphor isn't about geography. It's about access. Think about what defines an actual island. It's not just land surrounded by water. It's that getting there requires crossing something. A barrier. A zone of friction.
So Russia is surrounded not by water, but by
What he initially called straits. Later, he formalized this into a much more structured concept, the Great Limitroph. But the idea is the same. Between Russia and the rest of the world, especially Europe, lies a belt of territories that are neither fully Russian nor fully European. Eastern and Central Europe, the Baltics, Ukraine, the Caucasus, parts of Central Asia.
So, a buffer zone.
More than a buffer. And this is the key insight. These aren't passive objects just sitting between two powers. They're active.
Active how?
They have their own identities, their own political logic, their own capacity to choose.
Ukraine being the obvious, painfully obvious example right now.
The painfully obvious example. One of the most catastrophic miscalculations of the current war was precisely this: refusing to take Ukraine's agency seriously, treating it as a chess piece. Tsymbursky warned against exactly that decades ago.
But let me push back. How is this different from just saying Russia has difficult neighbors? Any country with that many borders has friction zones.
Because Tsymbursky's claim goes deeper. He's not talking about diplomacy or border disputes. He's saying Russia's very identity, what it is as a civilization, is shaped by the existence of this belt.
So remove the belt.
Russia is an island because the Limitroph exists. Remove it. Russia would be something fundamentally different. The Limitroph isn't a problem to be solved. It's a structural feature, like a coastline for an actual island.
So when Russia tries to absorb the Limitroph,
Conflict becomes inevitable. And when it respects the Limitroph as an intermediary world and works within its constraints,
relative stability?
relative stability. That's the theory.
All right, I'm starting to see the architecture. But where did this island emerge from historically? When did Russia become this?
By the 16th century, Tsymbursky argued, Russia had already formed a coherent civilizational core. It was larger than any single European state. It had absorbed peoples from the Volga, the Urals, Siberia, and the result wasn't a loose patchwork. It was something genuinely integrated.
Not ethnically exclusive, though.
Not at all. He explicitly acknowledged the incorporation of multiple peoples. The island metaphor? It's about internal coherence, not ethnic purity. Crucial distinction. One that people who cite him tend to forget.
And what about the East? All that territory stretching to the Pacific?
Interestingly, Tsymbursky argued the East was never Russia's real problem. It was vast, sparsely populated, sometimes economically burdensome, but it didn't pose an existential threat. No Chinese invasion was going to dissolve Russia.
So the danger always came from the West. Or the obsession did. Same thing?
The tension always came from the West, because that's where the Limitroph sits. That's where the straits are narrowest, and the encounters most volatile.
Now there's a word I keep hearing in Russian intellectual discourse. Eurasianism. Dugin, Trubetskoy, this idea that Russia is a continent-sized empire defined by geography. How does Tsymbursky relate to that?
He absolutely demolished it. And this is one of the most underappreciated parts of his thinking.
Demolished? That's a strong word, Gregory.
Classical Eurasianism treats Russia as a continental mass, forest, steppe, desert, defined by sheer territorial scale. Russia is powerful because Russia is big.
And Dugin specifically. For listeners who haven't heard the name?
Alexander Dugin, Russian philosopher, born 1962. The most prominent voice of modern neo-Eurasianism. Western press sometimes calls him Putin's brain. That's an exaggeration, but he's been hugely influential in nationalist circles since the 1990s.
Got it.
Dugin took this further in the 1990s with his New Empire concept. Russia supplies the territory, the resources, the manpower, and Russians themselves retain mostly symbolic sovereignty.
Wait. Symbolic sovereignty? In their own country?
Tsymbursky pointed that out with vicious irony. He said Dugin's vision would turn Russians into guests in their own civilizational space. And he rejected the entire premise. Russia, he argued, isn't held together by expansion. It's held together by internal coherence. Confusing territory with identity is a trap.
So Eurasianism says, the bigger the empire, the stronger Russia. Tsymbursky says,
The more coherent the core, the more durable Russia. Completely different logic.
and the Limitroph term itself, I love this. He borrowed it from the Romans, didn't he?
The limes. The Roman frontier zones. Territories that were neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian. European historians later used the term for buffer regions between major powers. Tsymbursky took it and scaled it up dramatically.
So we're essentially dealing with a classicist who looked at the Roman Empire and said, I see you, Russia.
Something like that. And it's why his framework feels so solid. It's built on centuries of precedent, not on ideology. He's doing the historian's version of showing his work.
One more thing about the Limitroph. You said Europe's relationship to it is ambivalent?
Deeply ambivalent. Europe doesn't want Russia to swallow these territories, but it also doesn't fully accept them as its own. Western support is substantial, but carefully calibrated, enough to influence, not enough to take full responsibility.
That sounds uncomfortably like what we're watching with Ukraine right now. Massive aid, but within limits. You know what it reminds me of? Turkey's EU accession. Decades of, you're almost in, you're so close, and the door never fully opens. The Limitroph gets the same treatment, perpetually at the threshold.
That's a sharp comparison. And it's exactly what Tsymbursky predicted. The Limitroph remains contested, in between, and unavoidable. Anyone who thinks the current crisis is a temporary anomaly hasn't read Tsymbursky. This is the structure. This is how it works.
Well, that's cheerful. So the Limitroph is basically a permanent geopolitical headache.
A permanent structural feature. Whether it's a headache depends on whether you're trying to fight it or understand it.
And Tsymbursky's advice is, understand it.
Understand it, respect the agency of the states within it, and stop pretending you can make it disappear. Because every time Russia has tried, things have ended badly. And the pattern goes back centuries. Which brings us to the part of Tsymbursky's work that might be his most brilliant contribution, and also his darkest.
I sense a cliffhanger.
Let's just say it involves a kidnapping, a very persistent bull, and about 500 years of history that keeps repeating itself. Remember the myth of Europa we started with?
The princess, the bull, the sea crossing she never asked for.
Tsymbursky turned that myth into one of his most powerful concepts, the abduction of Europe. And it's not just a metaphor, it's a diagnostic tool, a way to understand why Russia keeps doing the same thing century after century, expecting different results.
The definition of insanity, some might say. Or Groundhog Day. Except Bill Murray eventually learns his lesson. Russia hasn't.
Hasn't reached that part of the movie yet. So here's how it works. Russia goes through a period of internal consolidation, gathering strength, stabilizing, getting its house in order.
What kicks it off?
And then, almost inevitably, it pushes outward, toward Europe. The form changes, military, diplomatic, cultural, ideological, but the impulse is always the same, to prove that Russia belongs at the center of European history, not stuck at the margins.
And then?
And then, Europe doesn't cooperate. The advance provokes resistance, overextension, exhaustion. Russia retreats, turns inward, licks its wounds, and the cycle resets.
Peter the Great.
Classic case. His reforms weren't just about building a navy or importing German engineers. They were an attempt to drag Russia bodily into European political and cultural space. Catherine the Great, her Black Sea campaigns, the partitions of Poland.
Those were the same thing?
Steps to secure Russia's standing as a European great power, not regional power plays, European integration by force. Then the Napoleonic era, then the Crimean War, then the Soviets trying to export revolution westward. Every generation gets its own version of the cycle.
Russia as the moth returning to the flame, over and over and over. You'd think eventually the moth would learn.
And the flame never cooperates. That's the tragedy Tsymbursky identifies. Europe almost never allows itself to be fully captured. Each attempt generates resistance, isolation, and, crucially, internal strain in Russia.
But here's what I struggle with. Isn't this a bit deterministic? Russia can't help itself. That sounds like it removes responsibility.
That's a fair challenge. And Tsymbursky wasn't saying individuals don't make choices. But here's the question he kept coming back to. Why does the cycle survive changes of ideology, regime, and even centuries? Why does it outlive czars, general secretaries, and presidents?
Tell me.
Because, he argued, the impulse isn't located in any one leader or system. It's structural, embedded in Russia's relationship to European space itself. The pattern persists across very different political systems, precisely because it's deeper than individual will.
So it's not Russia is doomed. It's this is the default setting. And unless you consciously override it,
you'll end up doing the same thing again. Yes. And here's a detail I find particularly striking. The Southern and Eastern campaigns.
What, the Caucasus? Central Asia?
Most people treat those as separate stories. Tsymbursky argued they were instrumental. Moves south and east were ways of strengthening Russia's position for the real target, Europe. Russian expansion on the map doesn't move in a straight line. It loops back west. Always.
Because Europe is the gravitational center. The sun Russia can't stop orbiting.
Of Russian geopolitical ambition. Yes. Everything else orbits around it.
That's kind of obsessive, isn't it?
Tsymbursky would say, structurally obsessive. And self-defeating.
But, and this is the uncomfortable part, he also acknowledged that Russia has a genuinely expansionist and often aggressive character. He wasn't just describing patterns, he was naming something that Russian authorities tend not to admit.
Which is why he's respected and resented in almost equal measure. He agreed with many Western observers that Russia can be a threat, but he understood the mechanism. Russia becomes a threat specifically when it acts on the abduction impulse, when it tries to dominate the Limitroph, to force itself into European space.
And the structural limits?
This is crucial. Russia's civilizational core is enormous in territory, but relatively small in population. Among global powers, only Japan combines a comparable demographic scale with a significant international role. And even there, the context is entirely different.
So Russia simply doesn't have the people to absorb the Limitroph.
Not just militarily or politically, but socially and culturally. You can seize a territory, governing it, integrating it, making it genuinely yours. That's a completely different problem. And Tsymbursky saw this overextension as one of the key reasons the Soviet Union collapsed.
The core was stretched too far, and then it snapped.
Trying to hold together territories in Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia that were historically and culturally distinct. The strain eventually broke the system.
And the mismatch runs both ways, right? Europe can't absorb Russia either.
Exactly. Russia is too large, too distinct, too historically specific. Europe will never fully accept Russia as one of us. And Russia will never fully subsume Europe. These aren't temporary political failures.
They're structural realities.
Structural realities. And the recurring tragedy, in Tsymbursky's view, is that Russia keeps ignoring this fact. Each generation discovers it anew, and each generation pays the price.
So what's his prescription? If the cycle is so deeply embedded, what breaks it?
Cooperation without assimilation. Recognize the Limitroph. Acknowledge the differences. Stop trying to abduct Europe. And this is where it gets truly radical. Turn inward. Not in isolation, but in focus, which is exactly what we'll talk about next.
More surprising than Russia is an island?
More surprising. And way more politically inconvenient.
All right. So Tsymbursky says, stop chasing Europe. Turn inward. What does inward actually look like?
This is where he becomes an explicitly anti-heroic thinker. And I mean that as a precise description, not an insult. He was deeply skeptical of grandiose visions, the idea that Russia has some sacred mission to save the world, or that the present generation should sacrifice itself for some abstract future glory.
That's basically the opposite of the entire Russian literary tradition.
And the political tradition, and the military tradition, and most dinner conversations. But Tsymbursky was dead serious. He called those ideas dangerous illusions, and argued that the normal, healthy condition of Russia is not imperial greatness, but survival combined with internal stability.
That sounds modest. Almost boring.
It is modest, and that's precisely what makes it radical. In a country addicted to grandeur, saying just survive and be stable is practically revolutionary.
The most heroic thing a Russian thinker can do is refuse to be heroic.
Exactly. But it's not empty modesty. He had a specific vision. And I want to read you something he actually wrote, because I think the language matters here. This is Tsymbursky in his own voice. Russia must proclaim and, above all, establish in its complex circumstances a high culture of life, opposing the dark specter looming over the global human community.
God.
A geopolitical thinker. A man who spent his career analyzing borders and empires and civilizational collisions, and his ultimate prescription comes down to this: not conquest, not revenge, not even recognition, a high culture of life.
Just life.
He was trying to redefine what national strength means. Not territory, not military reach, not ideological influence, but the quality of everyday existence, social trust, cultural continuity, dignity, the ability of ordinary people to live meaningful lives within their own civilization.